Grief is real, big, better shared. The podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear.
I'm Diane Brockmeyer, the CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who choose to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to help bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Grief support is especially meaningful to me, as it was a tremendous help to my daughter, who lost her dad when she was 7 years old. 20 years later, she still recalls the positive, safe feelings she had with her grief support group. They understood her. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance. For more information about becoming a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
Hello, welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared, the podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear. I'm Angela Hamblin Kelly, and I'm the administrator of the Baptist Centers for Good Grief, and I'm joined here today with two colleagues from the Memphis community to discuss grief of a homicide death. So today I'm joined with two colleagues, and we want to focus in this episode on the unique grief and characteristics of homicide loss. And so this can be a very overwhelming topic, but very necessary, especially in our community, so that we know how to support our families. So if you all would like to take a minute to introduce yourselves, that would be great.
Great. I'm Sandy Bromley, the director of the Shelby County Crime Victims and Rape Crisis Center. Thank you so much for having us on today. We're really excited to be able to talk about our services and really just how we can support other folks impacted by complex trauma and grief that homicide gives, unfortunately, to way too many people in our community. The Crime Victims and Rape Crisis Center is a comprehensive victim service center. We serve all victims of crime, all different crime types. We run a 24/7 rape crisis center. We work to follow the victim through the criminal justice process and a whole bunch of different other ways. Anything really the victim needs after crime, we're there to support them through that. And I will turn it over to Tina to talk specifically about our work with homicide survivors.
Well, thank you all. Yes, my name is Tina Gray, and I'm the Cross Services Team Supervisor at the Crime Victims and Rape Crisis Center. And as we know, many of us know all too well that homicide is a crime that is both tragic and devastating. It can leave families and co-victims struggling to survive life after death. The Homicide Response Program was developed in 1998. And as a result of this program, we were able to assist co-victims and just surviving family members and friends in the community and others affected by crime. We serve both adults and children at our agency, and all of our services are free and confidential. So I definitely want to make sure we let you all know about that.
And we're so grateful, so wonderful to have just another great organization in this community to refer to come together and work together. And so just so grateful to have you all here today. And, you know, I have to say, doing this work at Baptist, going on 25 years, I'm also a homicide survivor. And so, you know, we sit around this table, the three of us, with a lot of professional experience, but of course we're people too. And we have that personal part that comes with us. So if we could jump in and just talk about what our families need in terms of support with a very unexpected, out of the blue, horrific type death.
Families need to know that they have support. They need to know that someone is listening to them. Mm-hmm. They know that a lot of people don't understand, but they need to know that you're there and you're trying to help them work through their grief. A lot of times people think grief is something you just get over, but it's definitely something that you have to work through.
Right.
So just having that listening ear, that non-judgmental person there for them, someone after a crime, after a homicide, someone that can maybe step in, cook dinner, take some extra stress off, help with the children. Because as we know with homicide, it doesn't, you may take a life, but so many lives are impacted.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The whole community.
Yes. Yes.
And you just never know. I mean, nobody expects to wake up in the morning and expects to be a victim of crime that
Right.
day. Right. And so your entire world is shattered. And like Tina said, even those most basic things, frankly, just brushing your teeth at some point becomes a really big task for a lot of survivors. And so really anything we can do to help them with their basic tasks at first, we don't need to dive deep into the complex grief that's going to happen. I usually tell people it's going to be a full year before you can even really dig into that in a real way, just because there's so many firsts in that first year, and there's just so much just survival, just one foot in front of the other.
Right.
And that's really all you can expect of people. And so we do want to manage those expectations as well. It's not something you get over immediately. It's really not something you ever really get over.
Right.
It's really just a matter of assimilating this into your life moving forward.
I think that's so important. You both just touched on that. It's survival. In the beginning, it is truly just survival, basic needs, one foot in front of the other, and the other will come, but way down the road. So initially, just support is needed. And it's the support of people who can show up and help with the practical things. I've had a lot of families say, just like, people showed up with toilet paper. I didn't even realize we didn't have toilet paper. I mean, just because toilet paper is off the radar, breathing is really all I can do to try to comprehend what has happened. Yeah.
And I think it's important to also not just say those, I'm here for you, or let me know what you need, because that's not extremely helpful for survivors who maybe don't even know what they need sometimes. So you're right.
Exactly.
You do kind of have to show up with the thing in your hands, whether it's the dinner or the toilet paper or whatever, because survivors don't even know what to ask for, right? They're so overwhelmed at that point that you almost have to just sort of do it. And, and you can ask for forgiveness if you overstep, but at least support in some way, in some practical way.
Yeah, I've seen that with survivors of homicide. Is just that level of denial and shock is just, it's a level like no other. Just because, again, like you said, nobody wakes up today thinking, my loved one is going to be, their life is going to be taken from us today. And so that denial, that shock, that's where I think the body really does just shut down just into, what do I have to do to survive just sitting here?
Right. Even from making the funeral arrangements, a lot of the survivors, they're not able to totally comprehend that their loved one is no longer here. So when you're talking about, I need you to make arrangements, go pick out a casket, get a funeral card, those type of things. Having that support there is tremendously helpful for a lot of family members, just to have someone to help walk you through that. And even if you can't go, they can go for you and come back and fill you in on details. Helping with the obituary. Things like that. It seems so small, but it is huge.
It is huge.
To the person who's trying to make those arrangements. Support again.
And of course, that's for people who have their loved ones' bodies. We know too that sometimes bodies are never recovered, or it may be after a lengthy period if the person was missing. And so that's a complicating factor.
Right.
And so it may be that someone's not doing funeral planning maybe ever, or it may be weeks or months. And that's a issue too, because that means that the rest of the world has kind of gone back to normal, and then you're trying to plan a funeral, and
you're trying to plan a funeral. You're trying to communicate with law enforcement. You're still trying to get details, and that complicates it even more. And when you have someone, even in cases where the crime, we don't know exactly what happened, and some people may be blaming the victim. That complicates it, because now you're trying to validate your feelings, and it may be one of those cases Well, you have others saying, well, what was that person doing?
Right.
And that's not what a family member wants to hear at that time.
No.
They have
Absolutely not.
lost their loved one.
Right. Right. I always say every single one of us starts off in this world as a tiny, squishy little baby that everybody loves. And when people die, there are people that's what they still see as that tiny little squishy baby,
Right.
you know, and people forget that when they say things, whether it's, you know, the people on social media or commenting on, you know, the news sites with their thoughts and opinions.
Right.
It's extremely hurtful. Yeah.
And sometimes just being able to turn it off.
Yes.
You have so much information coming in. And when it comes to social media, you have to determine what's helpful for
Right.
you.
Right.
And if it's not helpful and you find that it's causing more pain than helping what you're trying to do, you may have to disconnect, maybe for a little while, not forever, but just for a little while.
Right.
Yeah. And that can be really hard. A lot of people, I think it's natural for folks immediately to jump to victim blaming. And that's because we don't want to think it could happen to us.
Right.
And so we jump to, oh, well, they were in a wrong place at wrong time. I wouldn't do that. And so therefore this won't happen to me. It's a self-protective thing, but it is super painful for families to hear that. No mama wants to hear. It doesn't matter what your son's doing. No mama wants to hear about it.
Right.
Bottom line, she lost her son.
That's right.
And so really just trying to make sure that you support the loss and validate the loss regardless of how it happened.
Well, like you were talking about that mama, I have a client in particular I'm thinking about who her son was murdered. And when she came in for the first time, we were just sitting down and just kind of doing some of the basics, you know, just logistical stuff. And then I said her son's name. And I said, tell me about his name. Was that a family name? And she looked at me, and it probably took her 10 minutes to be able to talk. She was crying, and she said, no one ever asked me about my son. They always ask about his death. They want to know the details. She said, I guess they think it's like juicy. It's a juicy story. And she said, no one ever asked me about my son and his name. And I think that's something we really believe in is, you know, the death is horrific and sudden and life-changing, but it's part of that person's life story. We want to look at their entire life. So especially as a mom, you know, tell me about that pregnancy. Tell me about that. The name. Where did you come up with that name? And I think that's so important, especially in homicide, is for families to remember that their loved one is more than that death, that moment of death. Yeah.
Right. And just talking about the loved one and favorite memories, favorite dinner, just including that person in your conversation so they know that everyone is not forgetting.
Right. Right.
Some people find it difficult because they think that it's going to make them think about their loved one even more.
Right.
Where they're already thinking about them.
Right.
So a lot of times people say, well, if I don't mention it, they won't think about it and I won't cause her any pain.
Right.
There's already a lot of pain, but being able to talk about that person and share memories and just talk about what type of person that was lost is very important.
Right.
And that person meant something.
Absolutely. Their life had meaning and value and mattered and made an impact on the world. Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about maybe what it's like for homicide families kind of coping with their own maybe heightened sense of fear and just kind of trying to navigate the world that feels very different to them.
Right. So when you have a homicide, there are, again, other losses, secondary losses. So if you lost a spouse, that can affect your home. If you were living on a 2-person income, sometimes you may not be able to keep your home.
Right.
So that sense of security that you once had, the life that you once had may change suddenly. the schools or private schools or wherever your kids were attending, that may have to change because of finances. Your health, as we know, homicide can cause tremendous stressors.
Yes.
It can affect your health and other just body parts, period. And just learning ways to help cope, that's very important.
We work with a lot of survivors whose loved ones were killed in a drive-by or it's just unintentional shooting. And in those cases, it can be really scary for the family because we don't really know if it's unintentional, really, at that point. The investigation is ongoing. There's, unfortunately, far too many cold case homicides in our community as well. And so the victim's own sense of safety and security is just, thrown off. And like Tina talked about, maybe you're losing that second income, but maybe you also just don't want to stay in that house anymore because it was shot up and somebody may be coming back, and you just don't know the answer to that. And so you're truly upending your life, and you're walking away from a place that held the memories of your loved one. So you're grieving that loss on top of the loss of the human, the loss of the place, right? Home is really important to people. And so we absolutely see that a lot.
Yeah, I think that's just so important to stress is that, like, I'm just going with what you said earlier, Sandy. We wake up, life takes a total change without anyone asking us. I like the word bereaved means to be robbed. And so, gosh, if you think about homicide rate, I mean, you have been robbed. This person you love has been taken. Nobody asked you. It just happened. And then, like you said, maybe I don't feel safe to be at home if that's where the murder occurred, or I am anxious out in the store, or I'm anxious to go to work, or those kind of things. And so life, not just one aspect of a homicide survivor's life changes, almost all the aspects change, especially from a safety perspective, because that goes into all aspects of life.
Absolutely, because we do have a lot of victims that say, hey, the person hasn't been apprehended. Are they coming for me next? Do they think I know something? Or what was this about? Is there something that I'm missing? And now you're suspicious of all the people around you. So that trust factor that you once had, now you don't know who to trust. Oftentimes, when we have a homicide, it comes out that someone close to you was involved. And we hear that a lot, and it happens. We watch TV, of course. And so just finding out who you can trust and maintaining a relationship without isolating everyone because you can't trust. And then changing your daily routine. Like you were saying, Sandy, just going out, and you have people that say, no, I'm not going to go out at night. It may have happened during the day. So now you don't know when to go out. Driving, having those memories, and again, trying to stay in their home can be so difficult, staying there, all those memories. And now you feel you may need to move. You can't drive down the street where it happened. So it changes so many aspects of your life.
You just made me think of, gosh, at least a half a dozen clients I've worked with who the person was never caught. And so driving down Poplar and wondering, are they 3 cars over? Or is that them on the street corner? Having no frame of reference for who this person might be. So then kind of questioning everybody when you're driving. I had a client, this was years ago, it was very hard for her when she was out and about, kind of wondering, is it you? Is it you? Is it you? And she had a wreck. And so then she was like, oh, I'm not sure that I'm even safe to be out, just because her thoughts were consumed.
Sure. That's the fear of the unknown at that point. And we also have fear of the known. So a lot of our survivors, unfortunately, get a bunch of information. Way too much information is, passed along in the streets. And so they may have information. They may even know exactly what happened and exactly who committed the crime. And law enforcement or the prosecutors maybe just don't have enough evidence to move forward. And that can feel really frustrating for survivors. It can feel very like an open wound that never really closes. I hate the word closure, so I would never I would never,
Right.
want to suggest that that's what you're aiming towards, but that, the fact that there's an unsolved case
Yes.
really just leaves part of that wound open.
Always. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and so a lot of times you have families, they want to solve it themselves. So
Yes.
now that we have social media,
Yes.
and you can do a lot of investigation,
Yes.
a
Yes.
lot of investigating there, and just the contacts. And I find that people can be very resourceful, and they do get a lot of information. And we just should suggest that they share it with the police so they can do their part and gather more evidence, because with a lot of these crimes, someone knows
Right.
something.
Yes. 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 So y'all have brought up the criminal justice system, and I think just having done this work, the amount of time I have, I've seen a lot of families really struggle within the system. And I was wondering if we could sort of talk about how we can support families, what resources are there to help families navigate the system, like you said, when maybe they're doing their own kind of detective work and they want to share information, or they just want an update, or even just understanding. I find myself sometimes just helping families know, what a hearing is, what the different things are, and that you're not going to be going to trial in a year, and those kind of things. So expectations for a system that feels broken a lot.
Right. Managing those expectations, you're absolutely right. When we're working with families, I think a key part of that is educating them on the criminal justice system, letting them know what usually happens first, what are the next steps, and kind of just informing them that it doesn't work like it works on television.
Right.
It's not going to be solved in 24 hours. And
Right.
also you have to look at your jurisdiction. They look at other cities, and Shelby County is a pretty big area. And so our system may not work as fast as some of the others because of the number of cases that we have, but just letting them know this is the process. Right. This is what to expect next. This is what happens when you go to court, and just keeping them informed. Trying to give as much information as possible, and also letting them know that they're not going to be able to hear all the evidence. They're not going to know all the details because it's an ongoing investigation.
Right.
And we have a lot of families that want to know every single detail. And unfortunately, it just can't be shared because you don't know who is involved.
Right. Right.
And so just supporting them through that process and connecting the families with victim witness coordinators, with the attorneys. And like with our office, we're right there. We can be with them from beginning to end, from the first court date all the way up to the parole hearings. Just having someone to support you through that entire court process, if they so desire.
Right.
Some have a lot of family support and don't need it, and others may need more than others. So we try to talk to the victims and hear, what do you need? Tell us, what do you need? And we try to get those needs met.
It's great because it's so needed. It's such a confusing process and ever-changing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also the media, talking to them about the media. And some families feel that they have to speak with them just because the media comes to you, and just letting them know their rights.
Yeah. Let's talk more about the media and social media and kind of how you see families navigating that, or maybe what we could help families here today about navigating.
So we recently did a really in-depth article with the Daily Memphian with a couple of one victim of crime and one survivor of crime, survivor of homicide. And it was really cathartic for that survivor, right? Just super cathartic, because we had a great reporter, and he was very patient, and they did it on our terms.
Yes.
And they were in our office, and we were safe, and we were helping throughout the whole thing. And so in some ways, media and social media can be helpful. You can learn about coping tips from other survivors. You can, and as far as media goes, you can get the word out, particularly around these unsolved cases, which in this case, that's what that was an unsolved case. And so Certainly media can be helpful in those types of things. But then the flip side is we're not here for gore, right? Like this is a human, and this was a human's life that was lost. And so trying to make sure that that's the root part of the story, and that we remember that part of the story. And so, if survivors do want to talk to the media, we certainly encourage them to talk to an advocate and just really, we can even be there with them, or talk them through, what an interview is going to look like, the fact that they don't have to answer every question.
Yeah.
And you determine what you want to share, and don't feel pressured just because they ask to answer questions that you're not prepared for.
I don't know about you, but sometimes I watch, and this is usually more like national interviews, and I'm just thinking, can we just stop asking victims these questions? Like, and how did that make you feel? Or and you're just thinking this, you can just see the numbness and shock on them. And I guess just in those moments, there's not an advocate on every corner for every person. And, but those are just heartbreaking to see sometimes, those interviews. I think it's meant well. I think we're all trying to understand how some of these things can happen. And maybe that just falls back under, what do you say in times like these, Right.
And sometimes it's timing.
Yeah.
Right after the crime,
right.
You have some victims to actually speak, the surviving family members to actually speak right after the crime. And I've had families that I work with, and after speaking with them and they gave a statement, I'll say quite a few have regretted giving that statement. They said, I was emotional, and those were my emotions speaking, and some of the things that I said I wish I had not said.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, again, it comes back to the importance of the work that you all do, and having an advocate and having just somebody to walk with you when you're completely in the unknown of this new world, for sure. Yeah.
And just really helping the survivors understand their emotions. Trauma often manifests as anger, especially with homicide.
Absolutely.
Right? Like somebody, was, like you said, robbed from you.
Right.
And so anger is very common. And anger doesn't present well when you're going to plan a funeral or talk to law enforcement or, go into the criminal justice system and listen to how horrible it is every day.
Right.
The anger isn't often helpful, and yet it's a very normal reaction for these survivors. And so trying to really prep them for that and planning out coping skills before we walk in the door of the courthouse. I used to talk to some of my clients about just little things that I would do. For example, the padding between your thumb and your forefinger. For me, that's super therapeutic, and it's what I do in court.
That's what I do too.
And so, I talk to them about just little things that you can do to keep yourself, whatever, because you're just, anger is bound to come out. It's just inevitable. And so how can you manage that? How can you sort of manage your emotions as you go through this system that's frankly it's not fair. It's not designed well. It's still biased and racist and all those other things. And so, we're asking people to do a lot when they just lost somebody and continue to go through a criminal justice case. And so, just really talking to them about those emotions.
Right. And normalizing that, letting them know anger is one of those normal grief reactions. Sometimes it doesn't seem so normal, but it's a normal reaction. And we talk about it's what you do with that anger.
That's right. Yeah.
So,
and for a lot of people, they may never have experienced anger at this level. Like I usually just like to think about rage. I think it becomes more of a rage, and it's not socially acceptable at all.
Right.
But it's so normal. So, but really working on coping skills of where can this really be released, and where do we have to kind of be more socially acceptable?
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go into the bathroom and scream for a minute and then come back out.
Yes.
I've done that
absolutely.
a few times with my clients.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I'm constantly at the centers. We're constantly collecting phone books. If people still get phone books, like give them to us, because that's a really great thing to throw and rip and shred.
Right.
And anger, rage needs that release.
It needs a release.
Yes, my goodness. Because like you said earlier, if it doesn't have the outward release, it's going to find a way in your body. I remember just kind of doing some self-talk with myself over the past couple of years, like, oh my goodness, the cortisol that is flowing through my body. Angela, you've got to be mindful of this, because it's a reality, but also I need to let this cortisol find another place too. And oftentimes when we're in the midst of grief like this, we're not thinking about that, but it will find a way. We know. Yeah.
So we talk a lot about journaling. Put it down on paper.
Yes.
Write it down. Whatever your
Right.
thoughts, feelings, find a way to release it.
What about something that I don't think we have touched on, is just the violent nature of the deaths and people having to hear things they never, ever, ever thought they would have to hear. And maybe then sharing that with other family members, children. And I mean, that's another loss in itself, of this loss of,
Sense of innocence for kids.
exactly. And even for adults, like I thought that was
Exactly.
just something that happened on TV or happened to somebody else, not me. Just such a loss of innocence.
Yeah, because the world is a great place. It was right before this happened. So now you have a lot of thoughts. And we have to try to reframe and try to work on some of those reactions, because a lot of times we think, okay, everything is bad now.
Yeah.
It was all good. Now it's all bad.
Yeah.
So working on that in between. Homicide can just change your whole life. So all of those things that you thought were normal in your life, it was a normal life. And now I think I'm going crazy. Am I going crazy? And we have to just let people know you're not going crazy. You're going through grief. And that's one of those things that's hard to explain.
Yeah. Yeah. We talk about that a lot at the Centers for Good Grief, is that because sometimes people ask me, well, which grief is the hardest? I'm like, well, that is not even a conversation I'm having. But you just said it. I mean, there is a foundation within homicide loss that is grief. I mean, grief is all those thoughts and feelings that run around inside our bodies, our heads, our hearts, our tummies, our hands after somebody we love dies. But with certain types of deaths, there are complicating factors. And that's really what we're talking about here today, is the kind of the complicating factors. But at the core, it's grief.
Right.
And we do have to help people understand what grief is, because, the world we live in, I mean, there are sometimes people in their 30s or 40s who've never had a loss. So, grief can be a brand new experience, and it's overwhelming even under maybe expected circumstances.
Yes. And to compound that with the trauma and the violence associated with a homicide.
Yes.
Because so many people don't even really get to the grief very often after homicide.
Absolutely.
Because that is the core, like you said, but the anger and the trauma, other trauma reactions that may be occurring.
Logistics,
and
if they had to move.
Unfortunately, most people are not processing their trauma as well, or at least not processing them in a healthy way. Maybe because it's an unsolved case, maybe because they're still mad at the person because they didn't get the sentence they wanted, whatever it is. And so there's just so much unsolved stuff there that doesn't even allow them to get to that loss.
Yeah.
And so that can be really, really difficult for some survivors. And I think in particular for how to continue to live a family life, whatever that life was, and how do I continue parenting, and how do I continue being if I lost a mom or a sister, how can I still be a good spouse to my partner? Or if I lost, my partner, how can I still be a good parent? And I think a lot of times our survivors tend to just really not know what to do at that point. Right. And so we were recently at we held a community dinner with some survivors, and one of the moms just broke down and said, I've got this, I think her daughter was 14, she just doesn't talk about it. She doesn't talk about it. I don't know what to do. Oh my gosh, I must be doing something wrong. She didn't talk about it. Well, you know, how do you approach it, right? And do you guys talk about it? And you know, how have you made it acceptable to talk about it or not talk about it? And so really exploring that, exploring just how is parenting going to look differently?
Yes.
How do you still discipline after somebody lost their father?
Exactly.
How do you still do that? But you have to.
You have to, yeah.
Because without that structure, without that framework, you've got trauma now in an unstructured and chaotic environment. And that's just a recipe for future disaster. So, you know, really just trying to make sure that we're supporting folks to build their new life.
Yes.
Really is what they're doing. They're having to shake their entire world up and say, okay, what does this look like now? It doesn't mean that I'm forgetting the person that I lost, but it's that I got to figure something out for us right now.
Right.
Trying to find that new normal.
That's right. That's right. That new normal. So many clients tell us all the time, I really hate when you say that to me. I know it's a real thing. I just don't want it. And I'm like, of course, that goes back to when we look at the word bereaved, to be robbed. Nobody wants to be robbed. Yeah. Nobody wants a new normal. I was really quite happy with my old normal.
Exactly.
And it was taken.
Can we just go back to that?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. The other thing I wanted to say about sort of details, learning details. One thing I have found with survivors, and Tina, I don't know if we've even talked about this, but I tend to think that we always imagine the worst. And so I like to be really honest with survivors. I am fine with talking about details. There are a lot of folks who say, no, now, honey, don't worry about it, and just sort of pat your hand and pretend like you can't handle it, when really I'd rather hear the whole story, how it happened, how it went down, so that I'm not imagining the worst.
Absolutely.
There was actually a training I went to early on in my career called retelling, and it was actually walking survivors through the homicide again. And then this time they were present. So they were at least able to hug their son one last time or do something along those lines to be able to find some peace in that really violent moment. And so, and in fact, after the Collierville shooting, the mass shooting at the Kroger in Collierville, we did a site visit for the survivors. And I will tell you, it was one of the most profound healing experiences I think I've ever seen in my 22 years of victim services, because you immediately saw people remember more accurately what happened. And you immediately, they were able to process that trauma in a different way just by being there and those memories, because those memories are so messed up in our brain. And so if we remember, it's almost like we can go back and remember correctly this time. And so you're not recreating. I'm not suggesting we recreate, but you're at least there to be there. And so that's something that I really want to explore further with victim services is for all survivors. Maybe we do need to be going back into that moment, and because our brains just imagine the worst, and trauma just messes it all up so much that, I don't know. So back to just sort of talking about it. I think we mentioned that earlier. People are afraid to bring up loved ones, but they're also afraid to, talk about the incident. And I think most people do want to talk about it in some way.
I love that you said all that. I'm like over here, just like, keep going. Amen. It goes in line with me that with grief, right? Nobody wants to talk about grief. It's like we're going to catch it if we talk about it. Yet, we can't even find a Disney movie usually that doesn't have grief in it. Grief is a theme in TV shows and movies and all these things, but we don't want to talk about it in the real world. And then with homicide, we certainly don't want to. And those details, and I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I think sometimes we think about this for children when we're trying to explain a death to a child. We'll get very obviously age appropriate, but we know to kind of do it in these little shorter spurts, but give specific details, because we know their imaginations can come up with, and we sometimes forget to do that with adults. And adults with trauma, they need to hear that, because, and in those little, like this, then this, then this, because the brain will just take you somewhere else. And not that what the reality isn't awful, but it's an awful that I can I can understand. My brain doesn't have to work overtime coming up
Right.
with 30 different scenarios that possibly happened.
Yeah.
I can really process this one.
Right.
Yeah. And I also love, in a safe environment, having the homicide survivor be able to, even if it's just in their mind through visualization, being there in that
Right.
moment for that hug or things like that.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think it's important for people to know information as they're ready, but also accurate.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
Exactly.
key. Accurate
Exactly.
information
Mhm.
as much as
Honest.
possible.
Exactly.
And Sandy, you're right. We actually never spoke about it. And I've had victims where they had envisioned a totally different scenario of how it happened. They were told the end results,
Right.
but the way it happened, they envisioned something totally different. So when they were finally able to hear what happened, yes, it still hurts, but some had found some type of relief because they thought their loved one was maybe suffering more than they did. They just the smallest little details matter. And if you've imagined so many scenarios and you're right, the worst of the worst, and you find out, okay, I can handle that a little bit better, it really makes a difference with a lot of the families that we work with.
And just remember that humanity in general, right? So I was just thinking about another case where somebody came in and said, I called the morgue, I called West Tennessee Forensics, and I asked, whether or not my son was there, and they said, oh, you mean 212?
Yeah.
Just completely inappropriate. But from the person answering the phone, they were just trying to find a list with a number and
Right.
a name. And I get that from that perspective. But man, we got to remember the humanity.
We have to remember the humanity.
And it's just, and that's across the board,
Yes.
no matter what neighborhood you live in, no matter
Yes.
what ongoing violence, no matter what possible gang affiliation or not, or anything, this is a human. And every time we talk about them, we have to remember that this is a human. And usually I say it's someone's son because I started my career working in Prince George's County, Maryland, right across from Southeast DC. It's very high homicide rates. And I always said my clients were mamas. All I had was mamas,
Yeah.
back-to-back mamas.
Yep.
And there is no grief like a mama's grief, losing a son too young. Just none.
Yeah.
And we
That's
just
why I
got to
say
remember that.
squishy tiny little baby, because
Right.
it's really hard to find a person who doesn't think a squishy tiny baby is cute and lovable and want to talk to it for a minute. And we all start that way, and we all are still that in somebody's eyes.
In our mama's eyes, they are. Absolutely.
Yes, yes, absolutely. What else do you think that we should talk about for our...
We have a lot of family members that are very religious, but they found it not so helpful when people kept telling them he's in a better place. And God makes no mistakes. I've had them say, I know
Yes.
God. God is in my life, but that is not what I want to hear right now. So all those phrases, and they're not helpful at that time.
No.
They're not, a lot of families aren't ready for that. They may be later, but maybe not at that time. So we do have to watch those phrases. I think a lot of times we grow up and that's what we've been taught to say. He's in a better place. God makes no mistakes.
I've
It's
even
so
heard
many more.
families say, that they were told from various different places, maybe that just their simple act of grief was really kind of showing a lack of faith.
Right.
Now, we say all the time, grief is an expression of love. So that is love. That is love. I mean, grief is all that love coming out of you.
Exactly.
And also, I think people have to remember that we can feel more than one thing at a time. And so we can feel maybe disbelief or let down from a faith perspective, but also still have love and comfort and support. We can feel more than one thing.
And you don't have to be, because we hear this all the time, strong.
Right.
All the time.
Oh, that word.
You need to stop crying. You need to be strong for your kids. You need to be strong for the people that's around you. And That is so much to ask of someone that's grieving.
Right. Well, again, if we think about grief being an expression of love, when we're in love, we shout it out and we think it's cute and we make rom-coms and all this kind of thing.
Right.
But we only want to see the love when it's, I guess, pretty and two-sided, but not that pain. Because again, it goes back to Sandy, something you said at the very, very beginning, because I don't want it to happen to me. I'm scared. Yeah.
Yeah. Or survivors may, feel like they have to be strong for
Yes.
their kids or
yeah.
or for other folks. And, frankly, I think as a society, we're still pretty uncomfortable with someone crying in front of us and that kind of stuff. And that needs to stop,
Yes.
man. We need to start remembering that we, as humans, are designed to express a full array of emotions all the time, no matter what gender you are, no matter what race you are. We have full range of emotions.
Yes.
And we're okay. It's okay to express those.
Right.
And in fact, if your kid sees that, all the better, because the kid is then saying, okay, it's okay for me to cry too.
It's been modeled for me. Yes.
And man, those toxins get out. And I feel better after a cry. I don't know about y'all,
Yes.
but shit.
Right. Yes. I work with a family, and the parents were like, I don't want them to see me. I don't want them to see me cry.
Right.
I had a husband. He didn't want his wife to see him cry. The wife didn't want the husband to see her cry. The kids, when I talked to the kids, I had a whole family, and I talked to them at different times. When I go to my room and I cry in my room, and I asked them each, why don't you cry in front of your mom or your dad? Because I don't want to upset them. Well, everybody is upset already.
Right.
It's okay to cry. It's okay to express emotion. That's everyone checking in.
Yes.
And actually being able to talk about it, being able to find those coping skills instead of everyone separating and trying to do their own thing, which a lot of times doesn't work because they're hiding. And so the next person doesn't know how they're feeling.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And then it comes out in school discipline and other things, right?
Absolutely.
It's going to come out in some other way. So, So you might as well talk about it at home.
Right. And I think sometimes that comes from that fear, that uncomfortableness with grief. And so perfect. Like if you can talk to the family, we're all under the same roof. We're all doing the same thing in separate rooms. How can we come together and helping them see that?
Right.
Yeah. So it's not coming out in other ways or, looking for ways to dull it, through, I'm going to start, using drugs or abusing alcohol or all sorts of other things, something to make this go away, something to make myself feel better. Yeah. When we all have it right here, which is our body's natural way of expressing feelings, the need to talk, the need for community, the need for support. But it's scary and it's hard when maybe those around you aren't doing it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I've had so many kids say that, you just don't understand. We don't do that in our family. That's not what happens at our church. Nobody, this is, they'll say this is the only place that feels accepted.
Right.
Yeah.
We didn't grow up like that.
Right.
And we were told that, especially with the men, that you have to be strong for your family. You have to be supportive. You have to make sure they have everything that they need. And it sounds like then their feelings don't matter.
Right.
And of course, oftentimes, again, those emotions come out. They may not come out right there with the family, and sometimes they do in the wrong way. But you find yourself maybe having issues at work.
Right. Exactly.
Maybe days off, suspensions, things like that, or your temper flares and you may walk off, quit your job because you're dealing with grief issues that may be unresolved.
Right. Absolutely. And we didn't say this earlier, but with homicide and the complicating factors, and Sandy, you did sort of, you talked about this a little bit, that the real grief for homicide survivors really takes a while to get to because in the beginning, it's just so much denial and shock and logistics, maybe if they have to move or things like that, but then also just navigating the legal system. Oh, we're going to court. Oh, it's been delayed. Oh, we're going again. Oh, it's delayed again. And so all these things. And then sometimes, and this is if we have a person, in the trial. And so then there's sentencing and, and now my grief, so for a lot of homicide survivors, it's not that they're not grieving, but it's years before maybe some of that grief really gets held. And a lot of people can't do that. A lot of people are going to find other ways to cope with that grief. And like I said, maybe through addictive type things. And then they may go their entire life without really touching that grief because we've medicated it so long. So,
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of times in the beginning, there's so much, again, logistics, a lot of business to handle. You have to handle the service. And especially in cases with the homicides, you're dealing with court. You're dealing with your family, trying to make sure they're okay. And next thing you know, months and months have passed, and you haven't really dealt with your grief. And then one day, when there maybe isn't anything else to do, it can hit you. And we see a lot of that, especially with the 1 year anniversary. Oh, 1 year.
Right.
What am I going to do?
Right.
They never dealt with a lot of those feelings and emotions.
Right.
And they come out in grief bursts or spasms, and it can happen anywhere. We have people just saying, I was driving in the car and the favorite song, his favorite song came on.
Yes.
And I lost it. I had to pull over.
Yes. Those little things are so big.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I did want to mention with the holidays coming up, we have Thanksgiving, Christmas, and you have a lot of people wondering, what should I do? How do I handle the holidays? And of course, you have those that's going to say, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to deal with it. And when that day gets here, it kind of is right there in your face. And that's even more difficult to deal with because there's no plan.
Right.
So with the holidays, it's very important to have a plan. Who am I going to be with? What family, friends, support? And then also try to determine, am I going to shop this year? Am I going to cook this year?
Right.
Those may have been things that you have always done, but it doesn't have to be the same.
Right.
Coming up with your own plan this year, maybe spending time with friends and family instead of staying home and cooking or being alone. But whatever it is, make sure it's a plan that you want for this year. And one thing that's important that I always tell a lot of family members is that it's important not to spend your grief away.
Right.
A lot of times it's easy to say, I'm going to shop, I'm going to shop, I'm going to shop.
It's a form of self-medicating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's great if you're able to do that.
Right.
But if the finances don't permit,
It can hurt later. Yeah.
It's definitely going to hurt later.
Well, and you bring up such an important topic about grieving and the holidays. And our next two podcast episodes are specifically about the holidays. And just because we know that that is just an intense time for a lot of people, a resurgence of so much grief and because of past traditions and all those things you said, sometimes even just the food food is attached to so many memories and traditions for so many of us. So, yeah.
Right.
Well, another complicating factor with homicide loss is we have this person who took our loved one's life and what we do with that. So I thought we should talk about that for a little bit.
So there's a lot involved there, right? Because that's somebody else's mama's son also.
That's right.
Oftentimes. And so, you have the emotions attached to it about, why did this person do that? And do I ultimately have to get to forgiveness? What do I do with this person? There's going to be so much anger and so much hatred towards this person. And then as you continue to learn about them and their life history and all of those things that are going to come out in court, you start to think, well, maybe I shouldn't be so hard on them, or maybe I should, right? And so that can be just really complicated on top of an already complicated criminal justice system.
With families, you have maybe one family member wants to forgive. You have the next family member saying, no,
Right.
I want everything they're going to give them. I'm not going to forgive them. I'm angry. And it's in the same family. They lost a loved one, but they lost the same loved one, but those feelings and emotions can be very different.
Yeah.
So when you're dealing with the criminal justice system, sometimes you may have input on what are your thoughts? What do you want to see? What type of sentence? Or would you be willing to go for a plea? Or would you be, these amount of years. So when you have maybe even parents torn over what type of sentence this person is going to get for killing their child, that's a very complicated situation. So in the criminal justice system, you're looking at a lot of factors.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to remember that crime is prosecuted by the district attorney's office. It's prosecuted by the prosecutor, and they don't represent the victim. Right. They represent the state.
Right.
And so a lot of victims think, well, this is my attorney, and my attorney is going to fight for what I want. And while victims do have rights, and so they do have the opportunity to give their opinion, like Tina talked about, it doesn't mean that the prosecutor has to do what they say. And so that can feel really frustrating for victims as well. It's just really out of their control.
Right.
And in a time when so much is out of their control,
right.
it can just compound that. And so just helping victims walk through that process that, and I think Tina mentioned managing expectations. That's pretty much my job title, right? So as a victim advocate, that's what we do all day is manage expectations because here's what we can control.
Right.
We can control our responses. We can control our input. We can control, our victim impact statement and that kind of stuff. But other than that, well, we sort of we're at the mercy of a couple other folks in the room. And so just realizing, just walking folks through that process can be really, really tough.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there's no sentence that's going to bring your loved one back, right? And so that's the other thing is that sometimes people put a lot of their eggs in the basket of the criminal justice system, which is just not a good basket to put eggs in.
Right.
And so, also talking them through that, what if there's heaven forbid, there's an acquittal? What if they don't get the sentence that you want? What if it turns out this isn't the right person? Right. That it's a wrongful conviction, right? There's just so many what ifs and trying to make sure that you're preparing somebody for that, which is practically impossible to prepare for.
But I think that's the important part about expectations too, because really the only expectation, even if it's not conscious because we know it's not rational, is, well, I just want them back. And so there's nothing that can do that. So so navigating those expectations. Let's talk about our beloved city, Memphis. And you're probably having a lot of people say a lot of things to you about Memphis and crime and violence, and just wondering how you're navigating that, just in your role. I mean, we have that at the centers too, and we love our city.
Well, yes, we do love our city, and when we're working with families, of course, crime is everywhere, and what we want the families and the victims to know that when we're working with them is that crime happens. We hope to reduce crime. We hope that the crime rates will go down because one homicide is one too many.
Absolutely.
And so what we have to do is work with the families and let them know we're here for you. Let them know what services we provide and try to make sure that they're getting what they need so they don't become or raise kids who feel like I need to retaliate.
Right.
The system didn't work for me.
Right.
This is what happened to my person, my loved one. So no one cared. So I'll go out and do it to someone else because we hear it all the time.
Right.
Hurt people.
That's right.
So, living in Memphis, I've only been here for 5 years, so I'm still a newbie. I'm still definitely not a Memphian yet. But we have such a history of trauma, just such a history of trauma, particularly generational trauma, trauma associated with racism, poverty, and oppression. And I don't think we're getting at those root causes when we're really talking about violence, right? We tend to talk about take care of your kids, make sure your kids are in by curfew. I mean, it's very cursory stuff that we talk about instead of really just acknowledging the significant amounts of trauma that folks have faced. And if we're not healing that, and if we're not validating that, then what's the point of anything else? And so, one of the things that that's exactly what I often go out and talk about is like, we got to heal our trauma.
Yes.
We have. And validation is one of the very first things we can do to help victims and survivors on their way to healing, because the simple fact saying, yes, I'm sorry that happened to you, can go such a long way.
Absolutely.
Such a long way. Same for, we just have such long history. I mean,
Generational
trauma. And then I think, what we've lost is hope.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of science around hope now. And one of my favorite definitions of hope is that hope is the cognitive belief that your future can be better than your past,
Yes.
and that you play a role in that, right? So that things will get better, and that I can make it that way, that I have agency over that. And I think so much when you hear about particularly young Black men in this community saying, I'm not going to live till I'm 40, so why bother? That breaks my heart more than anything, because that's hopelessness.
Right.
And it's that is causing these cycles of violence.
Right.
If we're not breaking that, we're going to keep having these issues. And so we've got to start talking about the fact that we can change our futures, that you do have agency to change in your life, that you're not stuck selling dope or, whatever it is you need to do to get by. You're not stuck in that, which is easier said than done most days, though, to be fair.
Yeah. Well, I just felt it was important to address one, just because our history, the history of our beautiful city, and also because we love it, and we've all committed to doing this work here, and with all the incredible people that we get to meet. I wish we didn't meet them, but Memphians are quite incredible. But we know we've got generational trauma, and like you were just saying earlier, we just hand it down from one generation to the next because I didn't heal myself. And there it goes. So, yeah.
And I think a part of a big thing that we could all do is shift the narrative.
Yes.
So the other thing that I've noticed here, having come from Washington D.C. area, which also has some high violence rates, we talk about it a lot more here. In everything we do, our news is just nothing but negative. When we leave, we always say, be safe out there, right? I don't know that I've ever had anyone tell me that in DC before I moved here, but here it's every day I leave my office. That's what my security guard says to me every day.
Fascinating.
And so just thinking through, like, how are we perpetuating that as well? How are we perpetuating the narrative that this is a violent place instead of perpetuating narratives that the vast majority of people in Memphis are good people, and we have so much good going on. And so how can we start perpetuating that narrative instead? Again, easier said than done. But
Right. But, I can think about traveling and people ask where you're from and you say Memphis, and if they don't say Elvis, they say, oh, isn't that dangerous?
Right.
That's been my experience in the last couple of years. And
Absolutely.
so it's like, well, no, it's actually lovely. Yeah.
Right. And I thought it was ironic that I had family members from Chicago call me. I think it was last year, call me, are you all okay down there? I said, wait a minute, you all in Chicago. Your crime is a whole lot worse than our crime.
Right.
And they were calling to check on us down in Memphis. I said, wow.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I could talk to y'all forever. It's just so nice to be around a table with like-minded people who care about our city and care about our community and truly want to make it a better, safer place. And so I'm so grateful for both of you. But as we wrap up today, if there was one thing, and I know that's hard but one thing you really want a family, a mom, a homicide survivor to really remember and hold on to, what would that be?
Sandy mentioned it just a minute ago, to have hope that you can get better. You can work through this grief, and that there are people out there that's there to support you. Yeah. That's not one thing, but
that's okay. You put it under hope, so it was one.
That's good, because I have two things too.
See, we just do whatever we want.
So one thing I like to say, there's a lot of talk around trauma, like I mentioned, and ACEs, average childhood experiences, and people often train about that and then they leave, right? And we don't talk about the fact that it's possible to heal after these things, and that our brain continues to lay down new neural pathways until we're much older than we are now.
Yes.
And so it is completely possible to heal from even the worst things that happen to us.
Yes.
And I think sometimes we forget that possibility. And then I think the second thing I would say to most survivors is give yourself grace.
Yes.
Just so much of it. And I just talked to somebody who lost their mom last February, and he was talking about Thanksgiving coming up and just feeling awful that he wasn't going to be with his family, but he needed to go out of town to do something different this year. And I said, that's good. You're doing what you need to do, right?
Yeah.
Give yourself grace.
Yes. Well, you stole mine. Truly, grace was one of mine, but I'll reframe it in a second. But I think my takeaway that I would like people to remember is that their grief is very real. That this is real. It's going. There's no time limits, and maybe so this is where with the grace, maybe to talk to themselves the way they would talk to a friend. We're oftentimes so much kinder and nicer to other people, and maybe willing to give them more grace than we're willing to give ourselves. And I think sometimes if we can remember that we need kindness back, especially when we're in the midst of, just such devastation and loss. I think that's important. Thank you both for being here today and sitting here and having this conversation. It's hard work that we all do, and it's nice to know that we're not alone in this, but that we are doing this together to take care of our beautiful city and our beautiful community and the people that live here. So thank y'all.
Well, thank you, Angela. We're so pleased to be here and talk about our services, and so pleased to partner with Baptist because you guys are doing such great work for so many people in our community. And so thank you.
Thank you. As we close today, we want to remind you that our next 2 podcast episodes of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared are focused on the holidays. So please stay tuned for those next 2 episodes. And remember, grief does heal. Let me say that again. Grief does heal. But remember, your grief demands attention and care. Your grief is a reflection of your love, and you are not alone. This world is full of many grievers like you. You can learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can check out our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. We'll talk soon.